In the world of arts and culture, the departure of a minister often prompts a period of reflection on their legacy. The late Ambassador Nathi Mthethwa, who served as Minister of Arts and Culture and later Sport, Arts and Culture from 2014 to 2023, was a figure who stood at the intersection of culture and conscience. He championed a vision where artists were architects of their own destiny, initiating projects like the South African Cultural Observatory and the Cultural and Creative Industries Federation. But his tenure was also marked by a measure of controversy and questions about the implementation and lasting impact of these grand visions. To help us unpack this complex legacy, we're joined in the studio by Jack Devnarain, a member of the Executive Committee for the South African Guild of Actors. Jack, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Sad times where we meet, but let's talk about your recollection, fondest memories, if any, of the late Ambassador Nathi Mthethwa.
The late ambassador, and of course I remember him as the former Minister of Sports, Arts and Culture. And that's where the most of our engagements took place, and it was around discussions about the working lives of professional actors and creatives more generally. He was then and always a very polished statesman and politician. He was a career politician who took his work very seriously and always applied himself diligently. He was professional, and he was a thinking man. However, by the end of it, there was no doubting that he was a cadre who was deployed for party political purposes, and he was never able to escape that during his time at the helm of sports, arts and culture.
Now, when he came into office in 2014, one of his early priorities was the South African Cultural Observatory and reframing the role of artists from beneficiary to active participants. How well was that vision carried through?
The Cultural Observatory continues its work, and we're very proud to be a collaborator with them, because the work of the observatory needs to be research-based, data-based, and so that research continues. And I think whatever strategies need to be implemented must come from serious consideration and analysis of what the realities of the industry are. So in that respect, we do find that the Cultural Observatory is a very strong think tank. It's a very strong research-based organization, and they are a serious organization and one that deserves to be followed very closely. They will be leading the changing strategies that need to be implemented in the sector.
Now, Jack, the Technical and Production Skills Academy was obviously a bold move to address technical skills gaps. Has it borne any fruit?
I think that's something that still needs to be ongoing, because as much as they are active, there are always questions about governance. There are always questions about how organizations like that fit within a cohesive strategy. And I think for as much as you have organizations that are active and continue to do good work, you have others like the Cultural and Creative Industries Federation of South Africa, which was also established in 2014, that the incumbent, Minister Gayton McKenzie, correctly describes as a criminal organization. And looking back at the inception of SIFSA and the fact that they were used essentially as a mobilization vehicle for party political support, largely used as a slush fund, and also perhaps a training ground for creatives who considered themselves to have political aspirations. And that was a deeply flawed organization that hasn't answered serious questions about their finances, and issues of governance persist.
Now, we can't possibly talk about his tenure as Arts and Culture Minister without talking about COVID-19 and the COVID-19 relief support to the tune of 150 million rand, which was obviously widely welcomed. But there was much talk, much conjecture about how it was distributed. There was all sorts of action against receipt of funds. In your view, could this have been managed better? Or more importantly, what legacy does Nathi Mthethwa leave around COVID-19 and what he did or could have done for artists?
The former minister, the late ambassador, let's describe his legacy as flawed. COVID-19 was, I suppose, a fracture point that pointed to his failure to introduce regulation that would define the scope and the status of creatives, because he had to resort to, and the fact that he had to resort to, effectively charity as a form of relief funding spoke to the fact that he was never able to define the status of freelance workers. And we define ourselves as actors, as freelance actors. We are and should be protected under labor laws. The fact that the minister at that time was never able to create that kind of regulatory structure meant that, as a logical sequence, he was never going to provide a system for relief funding. So he was forced to rely on, charity as a form of strategy, which, as we know, is never a strategy. Because if, for whatever reason, we find ourselves in another global pandemic, there is still no structure according to, a formal regulatory system.
So is it fair to lump all the blame on the former minister when so many years after he departed from office, this remains outstanding?
Well, it speaks to the fact that there is no politician who has a reasonable grasp of what the dynamics of the industry are. But let's not forget that the late ambassador, during his time at Sports, Arts and Culture, had 9 years, which reminds you of what President Cyril Ramaphosa once said about his time as deputy president. He called it 9 wasted years. And I would say the same thing about Nathi Mthethwa. During his time at Sports, Arts and Culture, there were several goals that he could have scored, but failed. And you can mention, the creation of SIFSA, which was a failed political movement. You can talk about Silapa, which was some kind of wellness support program, which also failed. There was never any policy that was drafted. There was never legislation that was created. We are still in the same position as freelance artists without any regulation or protection under labor laws. And that discussion goes back a long time. And I think that's the primary point to be made.
Now, as we commemorate his life, what is one bold gesture or policy you would hope emerges from this moment to almost build on his legacy rather than leave it to mourning his departure?
We as creatives need to understand our own status better. And that message could have come from Nathi Mthethwa or from Minister Gayton McKenzie. It's a reminder for us as creatives never to rely on political leaders for self-determination within our own sector. And this is something that Saga is very strong on, is the idea that actors need to be self-actualized. We need to understand our status in law, or where we are lacking under any legislative protection, how do we acquire that? And we need to be better lobbyists. We need to be better advocates for ourselves and not have to rely on political affiliations, which was very much in vogue during the time of Nathi Mthethwa's administration.
You've talked about 9 wasted years, and as we wrap, if you were to find one feather to put in his cap, what would that feather be?
We had very, very cordial relations. He was a man of respect and dignity. It's something that we wish could have continued. But I think Nathi Mthethwa was a unique individual, and he was focused on the right things. But for the fact that he was deployed as a cadre, I think he might have been a lot more effective, but he will be remembered fondly.
Jack, that's where we'll leave that conversation. Appreciate your time. Jack Devnarain, a member of the Executive Committee for South African Guild of Actors, walking us through his own experience with the former Arts and Culture Minister, Nathi Mthethwa.